Hi. Hi, everybody. I was just informed that you couldn't hear any of that. I'm so sorry for the technical problems. So yeah, what I was just saying was just welcoming all of you to this evening's event. So yeah, I'm just making sure that you can definitely hear me. Okay, great. So my name's Sophie McCormack. I'm the Heritage Manager at the Northcott and leading a National Lottery Heritage funded project using our archive collection to engage with our community in Exeter. The collection is really vast and it's diverse in its content. It's housed and cared for at the Special Collections Department at the University of Exeter, who are working with us on this project. We're digitising the material from it currently, and this will be shared online on a new platform, and it'll be showing some highlights from the theatre's history as well as exploring some key themes. So a really big part of the project is kind of really opening up the idea of history and heritage and enabling groups and individuals to play a role in how we interpret it and share some of the stories from the archive. And one of the ways we're doing this is through a series of panel discussions, just like this one, where we'll be using some items from the archive to kind of really kick off conversations about the current role of the theatre and of arts and culture more widely, and as well as our personal experiences of this. And one of the major themes that we found while researching the collection with our team of interns was the impact of women throughout theatre's history, as both kind of major change makers and trailblazers in the industry, but also as unsung heroes who are often kind of sidelined despite doing really crucial and visible work that has meant that the theatre's survived all of these years. So I'm just going to share a few images that we've digitized, materials from the archive. So one such really notable person was Jane Howell. She was the second artistic director in the Northcott's history. She took up the role in 1971. And from the beginning, Howell had a really kind of clear vision of what she wanted in the theatre. She had a real mission for the theatre as a force for social change, and she pioneered performances in the city centre, in locations such as the library, the Ram, the cathedral, also in the prison. And as you'll see from these newspaper articles, just the fact that Howell beat 6 men to the post really made waves, even though she was really keen from the beginning to completely, really downplay her gender. And these early press articles, we really get a sense of the sensationalism around her gender and Jane Howell's swiftness in moving the conversation away from this. And kind of really always insisting on experiencing equality in her career. So in this image, you kind of can see a little bit more about what a clear vision Howell had for the theatre from the beginning. Really keen for it to have a social impact, communicate directly with the local audience. She took productions to the city centre and reimagined the theatre as more of a community space with a daytime programme. But as you'll see kind of in this image from this article, there was quite a lot of backlash early on to this approach locally. There were kind of feelings that she wasn't being broad or commercial enough. That Howell had a real directness about her work. And here she says that there is no average man to appeal to. And when she was pressed on her programming, she said, it is what I want. And that she couldn't do what she didn't believe in, which is such a kind of really strong response that we do really rarely get to see, particularly from women leaders, where it's all about pushing their own artistic vision. I just want to share this image. This is a really beautiful calendar from Jane Howell's first season in early 1971. She also directed premieres of plays by Edward Bond, who wrote Bingo especially for her. There's a really lovely image here from that production. She was a really highly respected contemporary theatre director. These productions massively increased the theatre's profile nationally, with the theatre kind of glitterati descending on Exeter for the first night performances. Her work received really high acclaim nationally from theatre critics as boundary pushing, and the production itself transferred to the West End, but locally the turnout was reported to be really low, with low audience numbers. There were really only a very few women who directed multiple plays at the Northcott, and these include Penelope Cherns, who has been researched recently by one of our interns, Alice, and I know Alice is watching tonight, so hello. Alice has been looking at Cherns' role in the late 70s in directing kind of large-scale crowd-pleasing works. Such as Anything Goes, which is pictured here, which was notable as having several women in leading roles, including a 24-year-old Celia Imrie. Cherns's work was really commercially very successful. She also directed West Side Story and Sherlock Holmes, delivering sellout shows every night, making a lot at the box office. These productions were led by an all-female creative team involving Cherns. There's lead actor Tina Marion and choreographer Anne Durham. And the press coverage of this working arrangement was really serious and respectful, focusing on their professional skill, which kind of really bucks the trend in what we see in much of the archive and how the media depicted women working in the theatre. So perhaps this different kind of coverage in the press was down to the real success that they were getting. So impact for women is going to be a really key thread for this evening's discussion. But another important topic is really the invisible work of women in the arts and in cultural spaces. So for example, community engagement, youth work, administrative and public facing roles have typically been led by women in the theatre's history. And this is the work that is often on the peripheries of the main theatre programme, which is kind of typically led by men. In the archive records, the voices and perspectives of a lot of the women working in these areas are quite underrepresented or completely absent in the press coverage. In production records and in materials that show us the internal workings of the theatre as well, kind of board papers, they're quite absent in those too. So we're going to hopefully in the discussion tonight do a lot to rectify that absence. We'll also be looking at future storytelling of the Northcott, so it's really important to note how women have been depicted and represented previously. So, you know, the women who are seen on stage were almost always white, able-bodied, cisgender, and on top of that, they were regularly assessed not by their acting skills, but by their looks and their youth. They were grouped together in press coverage that shied away from kind of the heavier, more serious topics of discussion afforded to male actors. And they were kind of often the subject of puff pieces. So Diana Rigg is kind of the clearest example we see of this. So a highly acclaimed and talented actor, which she was obsessed over for her physicality when she appeared nude in a play in the Northcott. The resulting kind of national scandal generated enough press cuttings for the incident to have its own entire folder in the archive, which is, you know, entirely unique. Similarly to Jane Howell, comments from Diana Rigg kind of sought to deflect attention away from her gender, to focus on the artistic justification for the scene. Interestingly, this article is from the Glasgow Evening Citizen, so it kind of shows the very wide reach of this story. While this was in the 70s, kind of the poor press coverage and representation of women on stage generally, and also behind the scenes, continued into the 90s, leaving a legacy of kind of the role and the impact of women working at the theatre being really downplayed. So yeah, enough from me. I'm really sorry about the technical issues. I raced through that a little bit, but please do yeah, send in any questions about anything we talked about around the archive. But yeah, before I hand over, I would just really love to encourage you all to yeah, get involved in the conversation and to send us some questions in the chat. I'll be feeding those into the panel throughout. Any comments, any questions at all. But for now, I'm just going to introduce our chair. So Natalie is a playwright and a co-director of Dreadnought Southwest with Josie Sutcliffe, which is an organisation that connects individuals and communities through the telling and keeping of great and courageous stories about all women's activism that have lain undiscovered and often untold. Dreadnought's very first showing of Oxygen, which was their first touring production, was on the Northcott stage. She is also currently writer in residence at RAM as part of Out and About Queering the Museum, and under commission with the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health, and next to Northcott to write a new play called The Beats of Our Hearts, which is going to be in production for 2022, which is about LGBTQIA+ loneliness. So yeah, thanks again. I'm going to hand over to Natalie now, and yeah, I look forward to hearing questions.
Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank Sophie and Exeter Northcott for inviting me to chair this conversation. I'd also like to thank Rachel Vowles and Sandhya Dave, who I will introduce more fully in a moment, and just to thank them for joining us and sharing their thoughts and experiences and hopes for the future on the impact of women at the Northcott Theatre. When Sophie approached me to talk about how we might look back to the past to inform our thinking and understanding of the impact of all women at the theatre through the Northcott's archive, I got very excited. I was excited to have a conversation about the uncovering of the archive stories and hidden treasures. There is much to celebrate and discover about the impact of women and the impact they have made at the theatre in a range of very different roles. Archives don't just hold the past, they are routes to uncovering what has been lost and forgotten, whilst also acting as portals to activate change for the future. Here we will be celebrating some of those who have paved the way, whilst considering how to be inclusive of all women's voices in the future. What can we learn from what is visible, whilst recognising what is invisible and why? And what have been the challenges that women have faced? This conversation is a beginning of looking more closely and delving a little deeper into the story of the theatre and the communities it serves. So I asked Sophie to find out how many productions there had been over a certain period of time at the Northcott, and I thought it was just really important to share some of the theatre's stats. And so between 1967, when the theatre opened its doors for the first time, and 2008, there were a total of 524 productions. 62 were written by women, that's 11.83%, and 84, that's 16.03%, were directed by women. Obviously, those are just two central roles in terms of the contributions of women to the Northcott. But those are just some of the early facts that are coming from the work that's being done with the archive. We feel it's important now to also look at the range of all the other roles and the intersectionality of the women who have contributed to the Northcott story, and to think about those who have been underrepresented. It is fair to say, and Sophie's already mentioned it, there have been change makers and trailblazers at the Northcott, beginning with Jane Howell, who's the first woman artistic director of the theatre, to the tireless work of chair of the board, Lady Lucy Studholme, the women behind the scenes who are making things happen in other ways. We would really encourage you to use the chat if you know of any women who you know have been instrumental or engaged or contributed in some way to the theatre's story as you listen to the conversation this evening. We'd love to hear from you all, and that includes people who are selling programs, people who are at the front of house, who are working behind the scenes as stage managers, who are lighting designers, who are working in costume, and all across in education and participation. So let's, think about, or who have championed audiences and encourage people to connect with the theatre. So anybody that you can think that can help and encourage this work, we would love to hear from you. So now to our guests. So I have a real pleasure of introducing Rachel Vowles. I'm going to just talk a little bit about Rachel first. Rachel first came to Exeter in 1993, where she spent a number of years as a lecturer in drama and theatre arts at Exeter College before becoming part of the team at the Northcott. During her time at the theatre, she set up the Northcott Young Company and the Northcott Community Company, becoming Associate Director for Education and Community. Since being freelance, she has worked for Plymouth Theatre Royal as a lead practitioner, and now spends much of her time as a communication skills facilitator and role player, working across both the private and public sectors. She is co-artistic director of both Nuts and Bolts and Playing Dead theatre companies, and is the programmer for the Theatre Tent at Beautiful Days Festival. This summer, Rachel will be directing an ACE-funded adaptation of A Midsummer's Night's Dream, set in a care home setting within the context of COVID-19. And after performing in a socially distanced production of The Comedy of Errors last year, she will be completing her Shakespearean trio by performing in a four-hander production of Macbeth later this year. And also to introduce Sandhya Dave. Sandhya co-founded Devon Diversity Consultants. Her work here takes her into the arena of training and exploring systemic racism and the decolonising of our minds and institutions. She is currently working with Devon County Council, Exeter Northcott, CAMS, Burn the Curtain, Make Tank, and Theatre Alibi. She trains on a programme from the Global Centre called Cultural Champions, which takes cultural diversity and anti-racism work into schools and the community. Sandhya has created Resilient Roots, a safe, brave space for people of colour, and offers restorative practice work. On top of all this work, Sandhya is also a storyteller who believes in the power of stories for personal and planetary change, and how sharing stories can help us to change the narratives we hold and believe. She was at the heart of the brilliant project Telling Our Stories, Finding Our Roots, Exeter Multicultural History, an innovative project exploring Exeter's multicoloured history. And she is about to embark on a project called Growing Resilient Communities in Exeter. So thank you both for joining us. So to begin with, I think what's would be really interesting for us all is just to hear a little bit about your experience, both of you, of working at the Northcott. Rachel, if I could turn to you first.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Natalie and Sophie and Sandhya as well. Well, I mean, my time at the Northcott, I was there from 1999 to 2009, and as I've expressed to these lovely ladies here, it really was the most happy time of my life. It was wonderful. It was absolutely brilliant to be involved in the theatre at that time, and to have been there when there was such support, particularly for the work that I am passionate about, which is community work and involving local communities in their theatre. And I think the management at the time and all the wonderful staff at the time completely bought into all that work. I mean, some people, you know, they were a little bit unsure to start with, and that's completely understandable, but I think the whole theatre community was involved in that work, and out of it came some really fantastic creative endeavours, really. So wonderful friendships were made. There were young people that have gone on, and young women that have gone on to become theatre makers themselves, and they're really making a difference in you know, nationally with their work. And also the community working with adults, it afforded people the chance to forge relationships with each other, with their local community, with Exeter, and also with the theatre. And I think a lot of people felt very much that the theatre was theirs. They had a real sense of ownership of the building and its place within, you know, a cultural place within the city. So yeah, it was an extremely happy time for me, that I just smile thinking about my time at the Northcott.
Thanks, Rachel. And Sandhya, if I can turn to you now.
Yeah, great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. And you know, it's going to be, yeah, lovely. It's interesting because I feel like I'm coming into this conversation not as a theatre maker or a playwright, but as almost like a community participant. So I feel like that's possibly the head space that I'm holding today. And you know, so I've come to the Northcott over many years, and it's interesting. I'm going to be really honest in these conversations. I remember having a conversation with the artistic director at the time many years ago, saying, you know, I just want to kind of ask you questions about your programming, you know. So as much as I love coming to the Northcott, I absolutely do really love it, and I treasure it as a space for what it gives me and has given me and my family. I was also often aware of things that I also wanted to see that I wasn't seeing programmed. And I remember, trying to have that conversation and almost being ignored, actually, if I'm really honest around it. So my experience, so it feels really, I feel lucky, and, you know, what it teaches me is life needs to teach you just to be patient, you know, and if you want something, you sow those seeds. And so it's really interesting to be in the space that I am with the Northcott now, where it is again in a really exciting phase and space of transformation. So really, really kind of enjoying being in that space with the Northcott. But there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about an institution, because it feels sometimes like an institution, as opposed to depending on who you are and what you're familiar with in terms of theatre spaces or cultural landscape art spaces. So that's kind of, I'm gonna leave it there for now, and then maybe we'll come back to that later. Yeah. And Natalie looks like she's frozen.
We'll give Natalie just a few.
Thank you, Sandhya.
Oh no, she's fine.
Oh no, she's there.
My back. Thank you, Sandhya. It's really interesting. We'll pick up some of those thoughts about what we would like to see programmed in the future towards the end of this conversation. I think it's really important to hear what you have to say. So thank you. And I'm really interested in also one of the things that we've sort of thought about are the wider roles, the other roles, the not so visible roles that women have undertaken, and not necessarily as performers on the stage that are the most visible roles. And Rachel, just wondered if you could talk about some of those women and the ethos in terms of, so just to start with, because I think that there's a connection in terms of your work in education and community and what Sandhya is talking about in terms of community participant, because in the end, you know, the theatre is there to serve the community, and what does that mean? So if you could talk a little bit about
absolutely
that.
I think Natalie, and I think the theatre's role within its community is to entertain, is to educate, is to reflect the community that it represents. You know, it's all those things, isn't it? And we shouldn't just see ourselves as passive audience members. I think there's a part for everyone to play in the theatre, really. And what I experienced was there were some, amazing women. I wrote a list for Natalie of all the names of the women that I could remember that worked at the theatre. And it's in my time there, just in the 10 years that I was there, it's a huge old list, isn't it, Natalie? It's massive. So one of the women particularly is Rachel Hartland, who's a resident stage manager when I was there. There were a number of female resident stage managers, but Rachel herself was incredibly passionate about young people and about taking them under her wing and teaching them the skills. So young people would come, or not just young people, but community members that would take part in shows that we did, and she would teach them the skills that she was learning when she was training at Bristol or Vic Theatre School. So young people come along, get this really very, very rich experience of what it meant to take part in a piece of theatre. So they were learning skills as well as forging all these wonderful relationships. You know, Tina and Beth in the wardrobe department, the same for them. You know, they spent a lot of time and helping people learn alongside doing the really tightly pressured job that they were having to do themselves. I think the theatre at the time that I was there really gave to people a true experience of what it was to work in the world of theatre. The education work that we did wasn't just a tag on, you know, it was very much embedded within the work that we did. And there were young people who worked with people like Rachel and Tina, who then went on and made that their careers. Some of them came back and worked at the theatre. Some of them worked at the theatre over like Panto when we used to do the open air Shakespeare. They'd be invited to come and work, you know, and get paid work. So these women weren't just doing their jobs in the background. They were offering out their skills, like generosity, and sharing their skills with people that came to work there. And I mean, there's many familiar faces, like you mentioned at the beginning, Ness, you know, often the first person you meet is the box office staff. And we used to have that wonderful little hut down in the town centre, you know, and there's certain faces there, you know, Wendy and Jenny and Patty that were very familiar faces, and Liz, who's our box office manager, became known characters, you know, and they're often, because they're the first person people would meet, they gave out that impression of what the theatre was like. Well, you know, a welcoming place, a place to come and feel at home, and not somewhere where you feel just a visitor, or that theatre's not for me. It was a wonderful family, I think, at the time, and I think there might be a few people that are tuning in tonight who were part of that family when I was there, and I'm sure they would agree with that. It felt a very egalitarian place to work for me, certainly, and I never felt that I was unable to do anything I wanted to do, or I felt very, very supported by everybody, and I'm extremely grateful to that, because I know there are a lot of people who came through the theatre at that time for whom it had a profound effect on them, and the relationships that they still have today, you know. Yeah. And then of course Becky, you know, so the shows I worked on, we worked in a bit slightly, you know, not unconventional, but I was the director. We had a male choreographer, so I worked with John Whitehead, and we had Becky Hawkins, who was our set designer. So our rehearsals are very much a female-centered space, really. Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, I think what's really important is that what you're saying kind of captures a.
Have we lost Natalie again?
Oh no. She'll hopefully come back.
Oh, she's back. She's back.
I'm back. I'm sorry, the internet is so wobbly today. What I was saying was, I think it's really important to hear those stories of how the knock-on effect a theatre can have, particularly for young people, and the value of education and community platforms for people to engage. And just to say that, you know, your time and that kind of 10 years that you were at the theatre it is a big slice of the theatre's history and its heritage, and that, you know, I'm sure.
No, we've lost her again. But until she comes back. Is she back? She's back. We lost you again, Natalie.
I'm so sorry, everybody. Yeah, so just to say that it's going to be a great piece of the heritage puzzle into, you know, for the archive, and for Sophie and the interns, and that, you know, that's being observed, and kind of what you've done is given us lots of threads to kind of to follow through.
I think following on from that, Natalie, something that I think would be really fascinating, that I would be very interested in looking at in terms of heritage, is, you know, I'm still in touch through social media and whatever with some of the young women and young men, but who have gone on to work in theatre or in the creative industries. And it'd be really fascinating for me to see how the theatre did have an impact on them making that journey, and how it's you know, that effect it's had on them. And I noticed there was a lovely piece from Amalia Vitali, who was one of our regular NYC members, who was coming to the Northcott just at the point we went into the COVID lockdown, I think, with piece on Charlie Chaplin, and she's written a lovely piece that you can see on the theatre website about how it was lovely for her to come back and feel coming back home, you know, to the theatre. So, and there are lots of Amalias out there, lots of young people, and like that.
Thank you. Sandhya, can I ask you about cultural spaces and welcoming women?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, no, totally. It's interesting. I mean, I'm really loving hearing Rachel today, and I'm really excited about this project because actually I've never really thought about the archives. You know, the idea that there is archives. So I'm really quite excited about, like, oh, what's there? You know, what is there? What, you know? And I was just kind of having a quick look at the Women in Theatre report, you know, that Sphinx Theatre did with around the Arts Council's 10-year strategy, and they were commenting on that and saying that there's in the 10-year strategy there's 0 references to women in gender inequality, you know, in that kind of body of recommendations. And I think and it's really interesting to sort of read that, but then hear you, Rachel, you know, and kind of go, but wow, look at all this that has happened, you know, and is still happening, because there is knock-on effects on people's careers and things. And in terms, and you know, I'm also listening, sitting here thinking, and it's about whether you've grown with this, you know. Like I never grew up going to the theatre. I never grew up going to museums. So that was kind of my life. So I learned, I was very lucky. So I was really lucky when I was about 15, 16, we had an English professor come and land in our life, who literally opened up that world for us, you know, and I really noticed that with my son, that he's just grown up with that. And I guess when we're thinking about cultural spaces, is that, you know, I remember there was a time when I used to walk into a museum or theatre space and I would physically feel uncomfortable, because, so it's a complete contradiction to what you're saying, Rachel. Like, I would not feel like this is my home. I feel like I don't belong here. I don't know what the language is here. You know, how do you operate? How do you move within it? And I feel like I've had to really learn that. And that's something that I think we as practitioners who are creating spaces need to really keep in mind, bear in mind. So often theatre spaces are, you know, they can be quite colonized buildings. You know, they can feel unwelcoming if you're not careful. And literally it can be something as simple as just on that day, somebody at the box office did not smile at you. But for you, it was that day that you were going to a theatre, you know? And it's that kind of mismatch that happens, that none of it's deliberate, but actually can have impact. So we have to really think about how we, you know, constantly welcome, and what does that actually look like depending on who is standing opposite you, the welcoming. But yeah, I've learned to inhabit cultural arts centres and spaces and theatres and museums. And I know that there are lots of people, because I work with Black and minority ethnic communities quite a lot, there's lots of people who just don't come to the Northcott. They don't see it as a place for them. So, you know, part of the work that we're doing with the Northcott hopefully will be that. It's kind of looking to, I think, what you were talking about, Natalie, at the beginning with Jane Howe, when she was thinking about, or was it you, Sophie? Sorry, you know, thinking about, you know, how the theatre space comes down, you know, to the community, and what that actually means. What does that look like? You know, what are the stories that need to be told? Yeah, I could go on.
Thanks, Sandhya. I was just writing lots of notes. If I looked like I was looking down, it's because there's a connectivity in how the theatre space.
We'll give her 20 seconds. She seems to come back after 20 seconds.
Yeah.
While she's coming back, one thing that struck me there, Sandhya, was that thought that the theatre is a building, but it's also the people within the building. So, and that's such an important, it's the body of people, isn't it? That that make it live and breathe. And I felt that very much with the Northcott when I've seen it at different phases in its life, because the Northcott's 8 days older than me. So, and it's the theatre that I went to when I was a young pastor. It was my first experience of theatre, and I've seen it as different things, but it's that feeling you get when you walk in, you're right, and how welcome you feel there.
And you know, it's with participation, isn't it? As soon as you participate in something, you will start to feel at home in it, because you start to take ownership of yourself in the space, you know. So there's that relationship that starts forming, you know, it becomes part of you and you become part of it. Natalie, are you back?
I am. I'm so sorry, everybody. The internet is obviously really playing havoc with this. Yeah, I don't know how much you caught of what I said, but Sandhya, I really loved that notion of how a theatre space comes down to the community, but how we might think about, you know, how a theatre meets the community. And I think, you know, there's something really connected to what Rachel was talking about and all the roles that women took in terms of education and participation at the theatre, and how that reached out and that nurturing. Rachel, when you talked to us about, can you talk to us a little bit about that nurturing kind of role and the mentoring of people who've gone on, young women who've gone on, who've been trained and now have careers in the theatre industry? And I think there is something about how the stories that are told and how as well that's really important here, and that in terms of thinking about women's stories and the stats from the beginning. And I'm just wondering if I'm going a little curveball here in terms of thinking about things we've seen on the Northcott stage that had women's stories at the heart of it, and whether they've stayed with you, and whether either of you have a memory of that and could share that with us.
I mean, I'm going to say oxygen. You know, I mean, what you guys did, what Dreadnought Southwest did, you know, which was just absolutely, I think the atmosphere that night was electric in the audience, you know. So yeah, I'm just going to go with that and promote you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandhya. That's very kind.
I think mine's slightly coming from a different angle. Mine is about seeing women come alive on stage. So it's about, you know, and through community work and youth work, often you are doing a bit of blind casting, because generally you have more women participants than men. So I'm thinking of something, say, like the government inspector that we did, and you know, the postmaster was played by, well, you know, we had Janet Hookway, wonderful. Nell Turner was one of the comedy characters, and my God, was she absolutely hysterical. Bob Tinsky, you know. And it's seeing these wonderful women just come alive and their confidence bursting out and being funny and being clever and being celebrated on stage. So for me, I guess it's not about a particular show that I might have seen or a particular play. It's actually about just seeing that blossoming of people on stage, really, and backstage. I mean, you know, we had hysterical times. I can remember once on a youth theatre show with Rowena Rickson and Claire, who was another young trainee stage manager. Well, they weren't even trainee stage managers, just young women that had come along to take part. And we suddenly had to get this piece of set off. And there was myself, Rachel Hartland, and these two young girls. As the curtains coming up, we'd been gossiping and suddenly realised we had, you know, it was just hilarious, wonderful. Just communal building experiences. It's really difficult to explain, really, unless you've sort of unless you're taking part in it. And something that I found was what happens in those experiences is age doesn't matter, your social economic background doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're there together for this communal thing, which is to get this play on, or this show on, and it makes you know, connections are so strong through that. That last and last, you know, years later, I still see people. I live in Exeter now, and I see people that from 10 years ago, and we instantly go, "Oh, it's you! Hi, how are you?" Or, you know, so theatre for me isn't just about the thing that happens on stage. Theatre, you know, it's the ripple effect that goes on and on and on beyond that. You know, those connections out of that help build those stronger communities as well. Sorry, I get very passionate, as you know, about these sorts of things, but yeah.
I was just going to say, should I share a couple of comments that we've had from the audience? Just so we've had a couple, so from Janet Gale and Mike Redaway, kind of agreeing with Rachel about that time at the Northcott and how they felt that it was egalitarian, and that there was definitely strong women in kind of key roles. And Nell Turner talking about that there were kind of the opportunities for young people through NYC and the skills learned, and that it was a nurturing space. but also now kind of agreeing with Sandhya, saying the importance, that it's really important that theatre is seen as an accessible space for everyone. And that really kind of chimes with, historically the theatre before it was even built, it was announced as a theatre for everyone, in Devon. And every artistic director that kind of took on the role of leading the theatre kind of grappled with, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a theatre for everyone? And they all interpreted it in massively different ways. And I'd be really interested to hear what the panel think about what being a theatre for everyone is about these days, particularly in relation to being inclusive for women, all women, and experiences not just at the Northcott but perhaps at other arts organisations locally, about how that message, how that's interpreted, how that mission is interpreted, I guess.
I mean, I think if I'm correct, the first production that's going to come on post-COVID when the Northcott opens is The Honeyman, isn't that right? And it's, being directed by Alex Harris from Beyond Face. So I think it's, I personally feel like the Northcott is so moving in the right direction right now. It's really asking those critical questions. It's really wanting and sensing excitement with that, the kind of reinvention, post-COVID, what the theatre space looks like. So it's asking itself even bigger questions, perhaps, further to Rachel, maybe what was being asked when you were there, and I think the programming has shifted, so I worked with the Northcott a couple of years ago with, and the theatre companies that brought a couple of plays doing some audience development work. And one of them was called Black Men Walking. And the other one right now, I can't remember, but it was about the Birmingham scandal. Nat, can you remember what it was called? I can't remember what that one was called. And it was just, it felt like, oh, okay, great, because for me, the Trojan horse, thank you, Trojan horse, yeah, and it was, and my job was to kind of do some more outreach around that, so potentially communities that might be interested in watching this play, who the play was directly related to. For example, with the Trojan Hall, it was the Birmingham school scandal around fundamental kind of indoctrination within the school space, Islamic fundamentalism. And it was quite easy to bring people in because the people were being offered to come and hear perspectives on a story that was actually very close to them. So that's one of the things that I would kind of really be thinking about when we're thinking about theatre for everyone. It's like, what are the stories? The questions are, what are the stories that are being represented for women? We're incredible beings, we're incredible, and we have such diverse stories. Let's see some of them played out. And I really like what you said, Rachel, earlier. This was in our conversation before we came on publicly, around, let's move away from high profile women, but let's come to all those amazing women who are living in our local spaces doing really incredible work, and let's create their stories for others to see as role models, achievable role models. So yeah, that's one of the things that I'd be thinking about. Yeah.
And I go back to something you said, Sandhya, as well, about, I think, this thing about the building, and it can be quite a terrifying place. And if you're not someone who's been taken to the theatre and as a child, if your parents didn't take you or your school didn't take you, they can be really quite terrifying places to be. So for me, it's about the theatre. I sort of probably didn't articulate this very well earlier, but the theatre isn't just the building. It's about what gets taken into communities and how communities are engaged with whatever that community is, in a space where they feel comfortable. So if it's a bunch of young people that have never been to a theatre before, but there's comfortable spaces there, is their common room, then we engage with them in their space where they feel comfortable. It's much more likely to say, well, come and experience this in our building, because that's what, is sort of demystifying that still the red velvet curtain image that I think a lot of people still have of the theatre. And, you know, I think we can't not say that historically there has always been, and there probably always will be, this thing about the Northcott isn't in the town centre. You know, people banged on about that since the day it started, and it is in the middle of the university campus. So, you know, there is a sense of, this is a high art, this is something that isn't for me. So it's about, if the horse won't come to the, you know, you can't take the water to the horse, take the horse to the water, or whatever. It's about showing that theatre exists as an entity outside of the big white building as well.
And I know that there are plans for the Northcott to take over the Barnfield, aren't there? And I just think, yeah, that literally is a kind of connected thread, isn't it? Down from the hill. I always sort of say up the hill and down, you know, and yeah, I'm really hoping that we're looking at all different kinds of intersectionalities, you know, and there's going to be lots of commissioning around that from the community, you know, and actually just having ordinary people, supporting ordinary people to write, you know, and create and direct and whatever it is, you know, light, sound, whatever it is, bringing people in and skilling them. And, you know, just sort of really saying to them, you know, well, what's the story that you'd like to see? You know, what is it that you would like to see out there that you're not seeing? You know, what story do you want to tell? What do you know? You know, and yeah, just really enriching us all.
Projects that we did as part of our community work, Sandhya, that you might not be aware of, was we had a writers group, and we would have different themes or challenges with that, and the writers would write their pieces. We'd have community directors directing the pieces, and we'd have community actors acting them. One of the pieces that we did was down at the livestock centre, and it was all based on rural life and green issues, you know. And it was wonderful, and it was all supported by the fantastic professional staff at the Northcott. So the people, you know, it was people were writing their own stories that they were seeing performed and directed by their peers, but given that kudos of the professional theatre as well. And it was, for me, that was a wonderful project that we did. And I know the writers group carried on, and Natalie came and did work with our writers group and was brilliant with them. And it's given people that may never have thought themselves as able to do those things, because they haven't maybe had the right training, or they haven't been to university or whatever, to be able to go away and do that and actually give confidence to say, well, actually, maybe I can explore that within myself, and I might have found, you know, I can find a way of expressing my voice through writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I'm just realizing we're not letting Nat getting a word in edgeways. Sorry, Nat. But, you know, like we've been doing from Devon Development Education, which is an education charity that I work for, we've been doing a project for 2 years now called Celebrating Windrush in Devon. And through that, it is about just ordinary people from the Windrush generations, first, second, third. And they've been telling their stories, and we've been supporting the development of that. So yeah, really exciting, because, you know, we're going to be working with the Northcott and again with Beyond Faith in Plymouth to hopefully, you know, just put a funding pot in to make a play. And it's like, that's so exciting. It's so exciting, because my most exciting person on there is Faye Doris, who's a senior lecturer and midwife, you know, came in 1973 from Jamaica, you know, somehow got settled here, quite bizarre, really incredible woman, but doesn't ever see herself as a creative, you know, just does not see her. She thinks she's just, you know, really organized. And he, you know, at the last storytelling training session that we did, she was like, well, you know, I think I could tell my story, you know, and it's this, like, exactly, it's just result, right? And, you know, so these people who were just ordinary people from the community are now kind of ready to kind of go, yeah, we might be able to come on stage, you know, and tell our story. And of course, we'll do the work, hopefully, with them around that, you know, and hopefully, yeah, it's going to be it's really exciting, really excited. Yeah. You can say something now.
No, I just, that's hugely
Oh no, she can't. Should we give her a few seconds? And I've got to have some good questions if we need. Hey, are you back?
Yeah, we lost you.
Sorry, I've got a really great question just that kind of feeds on from what we were just talking about in terms of community engagement, and how we were talking a bit about how, you know, there's a real gender imbalance in youth and community programs where it is overwhelmingly women and young women who are taking up that opportunity. But then there's kind of a disparity between that and UK theatre leadership. So, you know, the people who then go on to actually lead the organisations and make, you know, have the big budgets, make the big decisions, and just, yeah, be interesting to think about that. And, you know, there's been progress in recent years, but what do we need to do in our current leadership governance to change this story moving forward, you know, particularly in light of that Sphinx report where that is, you know, there is that big disparity in leadership. Yeah, what needs to change to kind of, yeah, you know, and there was another comment before about how, you know, at the Northcott that at times there have been more women working there than men, but undoubtedly those have been in the kind of the administrative roles, or, you know, I'm sure it would have been a real range of roles, but in terms of the leadership roles, I think that's kind of the key to look at. I don't know who wants to take that first.
I think the fact that none of us are saying anything, it sort of speaks volumes, really. In that I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I think it is harder for women. We talked about this the other day when we met for so many reasons. I think you've got to be really extremely resilient. You've got to be rather ballsy, and probably not take time out to have a family. Dare I say it? You know, you don't have to. Theatre is one of those places, particularly the creative side of it, in terms of directing. It's not like being a stage manager where you go and you train to become a stage manager and you take a course in it and you don't get a job until you've got that, you know, qualification. Or in lighting design or in electrics, you have to get their qualifications to be able to do that and get the job. There's no real route into those key roles, really. And I think women probably have to get a bit more bullish in some ways in order to fight their way through.
I'm just checking to see if I am no longer frozen, and just to sort of pick up on this question, Sandhya, if you don't mind. And I think that just earlier Sandhya did mention the Sphinx theatre report, or the report in terms of flagging up issues, you know, gender inequalities, and for all genders, and in theatre. And I think that one of the things that the report talks about is just even down to things like policy making. You know, what do our policies look like for cultural institutions? Who are the gatekeepers? And that, you know, so we've touched upon the fabric of a building, which is Exeter Northcott this evening, in terms of all the varied and different kind of roles. You know, as I said at the beginning, we're scratching the surface. This is just the beginning, and the work the archive will do will dig a lot deeper into those contributions, and to recognise where those pinch points are, and where you know, in terms of where leadership maybe doesn't open itself up to women, and within that there are also the intersectionalities that we have to think about, in terms of that it, you know, can become even more, for example, and how does those kind of very fundamental things, we think about it a lot at Dreadnought, in terms of how do our policies reflect what we really want to achieve, and what we, you know, is really vital in terms of being as inclusive as we can be. And you know, and we are in a moment and a period of change, because
I could go to some yeah, there was some good comments on this.
And
oh, hang on.
so asked sort of where we're going in.
Nat, we lost connection with you when you were saying periods of change. I don't know if you wanted to try and pick up from there. No.
I don't know if Sandhya, if you wanted to maybe pick up on when Natalie was talking a bit more about the intersectionality of the issue as well.
Yeah, and I think as Rachel said, the silence or the pause before any of us jumped in just shows how vast a question that is and what needs to be unpicked in order for women to be able to step into these leadership roles. And, you know, my very basic answer would be men could just get out the way. You know, they could just be graceful and get out the way. You know, in some ways, what we're talking about is bigger systemic issues. So intersectionality, absolutely. And, you know, we're talking about privilege here, aren't we? And we're talking about people, men in this case, perhaps, you know, needing to, I'm going to say graceful again, around their positioning and protecting their own privilege, you know, and actually, can they be graceful to kind of consider, you know, who else can do this work? You know, can decision makers, I'm going to say take risks, but they don't need to take risks because we know that women can do the job just as well. But there's something, there's a shadow, there's a legacy of a shadow that's hanging over here around, you know, can women do the job? And of course we can do the job, but as Rachel said, often we're interrupted from doing the job for various reasons, from, you know, being a parent to just kind of legacies of institutional sexism, if you like, you know, as we would, and intersectionality absolutely plays in that. So, and that's why I'm celebrating, you know, Alex Harris, who's a mixed heritage woman, you know, being given that opportunity to be a director, you know, of a performance, you know, in a play. I think Daniel's done a really great thing by creating that space for her to do the work and hopefully supporting her to do that. So that would be a kind of more softer answer, but it's big, you know, we're talking, it's huge, isn't it? To tackle systemic sexism is huge, you know, but yeah, men just get out the way, let the women do the job, you know, we know how to do it.
So what are the stories that we want to hear and see and experience now? And Sandhya, you have talked about that with the Windrush stories. Rachel, I wonder, that's one example, but if we could just, you know, this is sort of us coming towards the end of the areas that we want to talk about. And so if we could just think a bit more about what might we want to experience now moving forward. And Rachel, if you could pick that up, that would be great.
Well, for me, I think, you know, our society's become more and more fractured, isn't it? And we're constantly hearing about, you know, the news is never good, is it, about how we interact with each other? And for me, it's always about, you know, celebrating not just our difference, it's actually celebrating where we come together and those points that make us human and make us connect to each other. So for me, I'm interested in the stories of normal people, of real people, of everyday people, of people from our communities. I'm interested in them. I'm not really interested in, I mean, there's a personal thing, isn't it? But we mentioned the other day when we talked, didn't we, Les Mis, you know, if you look at something like that, everybody knows this. It's a mass, you know, people flock and flock and flock to see it. It's one of the most seen pieces of theatre in the universe. And the stories in it are actually about the people on the ground. They're just the everyday people. And that's for me, what interests me is, where do we all connect and how do we share our stories to make us feel more connected as human beings? And Natalie, you know, your play that you're writing now about loneliness, why are we lonely in the 21st century? But we are. And So for me, that's where I would like to see is bringing people together to share where we touch, where we communicate as humans, and celebrate our differences.
Thank you. And Sandhya, I don't know if you have anything else to contribute to that question.
I think, yeah, absolutely, really agree with that. And then also seeing, you know, art plays about challenging issues, you know, that issues that we shouldn't be scared to talk about. So like with Trojan Horse or racism, you know, having those stories, but like following on from what Rachel was saying, you know, we've got an incredible diverse community in Exeter, you know, and I think I would want to see, so for example, I come from a Hindu Indian background, you know, I want to see the Ramayan, you know, which is the Diwali story. I want to see that, you know, at Diwali time, you know, on at the theatre. And I want to hear about the International, you know, Mother Language Day that Bangladesh campaigned for with the UN. And, you know, what's the story behind that? You know, what's the politics behind that? I want to kind of learn, you know, I always say to people, we're really rich in the outdoors in Devon, but we are kind of multiculturally deprived, and we don't need to be, because there are lots and lots of communities who are bringing us lots and lots of stories, whether kind of myth, folk, traditional to kind of political, and let's invite them to tell us what they are. I'd like to see more of that, so that we can all be enriched, you know, and the world comes to us, you know, the world comes to us in our theatre space. Yeah, so that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Sandhya. Thank you, Rachel, for your responses to that. I'm just going to ask, just yes, absolutely, is my response. Absolutely. And there's something about the theatre and its heart, isn't there? And that idea of the theatre being part of a community, and so what's the heart of something, and as somebody who is really interested also in not just theatre but archives and the role and the impact that all women have had in those two fields and what archives can produce, there's definitely something about what the heart of the archive, Sophie, that you're discovering. What are the beating hearts of the archive, and that these series of conversations will start to reveal some of those key kind of pulse points of the archive, if you like, and this just being the first one. And I was just wondering if we have any questions from the chat or any conversations as we kind of move forward.
Yeah, there was some interesting discussion around Elaine Faulkner, for instance, who she's working at the Northcott at the moment, and she's you know, she's the first female kind of manager leader of the tech department in the theatre's history, and so, you know, that in itself is to be celebrated, and then, you know, also kind of her insights into why it's difficult as well. There's kind of been a bit of conversation around that, why it is difficult for women to go into those leadership roles, and yeah, people touching on the fact that the starting of a family is kind of a biggie in the arts industry. You know, I've personal experience of it myself, you know, with both of the children that I have had huge impacts on my kind of, you know, my career and where it was going and the places that I was working at, and particularly I think in the arts, it's you know, it's a very tough industry, and you know, the theatre, when you look at its history, it's very like this in terms of funding, and there's always that kind of having to kind of you know, fundraise for your own role or fundraise for your own projects and really elbow room your way into things to make a difference, and that can really be hindered if you've got to take, you know, a few months out to have a baby, and I think that's kind of a big thing that people are kind of flagging here. But yeah, I've also asked people to kind of talk about what stories they want to see on the stage or championed by the Northcott. Haven't had any responses yet, so just give everyone, that's just me giving everyone a nudge to have a think and share some of that kind of future facing stuff. Not necessarily just on the stage, but projects that have gone before that you'd like to see come back. Janet Gale mentioned the play in 24 hours project that from a while back, and so if there's anything like that people wanted to raise as well, would be great.
That was wonderful. That was an incredibly mad, wonderful thing. And I do think it's worth flagging up, Sophie, and I think it's a whole other issue, isn't it? The arts is the most welcoming. Everyone is welcome in the arts. We know that, don't we? We know that that's why we go to it ourselves, because we feel at home there. But it is still the place that I think is the harshest in terms of if you are with a family, a woman. And I hate to say, I know there are men who take on the key parent responsibilities, but I think for women, it's really tough. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, it's the most, supportive, generous, welcoming community, and in another, it's hard.
I would definitely say the intention is there, that it's inclusive. That's definitely the stall that the arts sets out. But whether that's realised in practice, in the way that the working environment and the way that it, the work that it prioritises, it's really interesting to see how that plays out. And I
think that it returns to the systemic sexism that Sandhya was talking about, in terms of the kind of the layers and the fabric of our society and how things are set up. But I think just I want to just turn to the archive just again, and Sophie, if there is anything that anything else that has really kind of caught your eye in terms of women in the archive at the Northcott and that impact, if there's anything else, this is, I think, a moment to kind of to share, because you've talked about there's going to be an online platform, and I wonder how we might access this material, this information, how people who have joined us this evening who want to find out more might access this, and how we develop, how the stories and the new stories can be added and develop what you're doing there, because there are opportunities for community engagement to hear other stories, aren't there?
Yeah, thank you. So there will be a kind of a platform going live in the next few weeks, which will share some of the things that we've digitized. The things that we've selected to digitize, we've been really kind of selective in what we're choosing, and it's items kind of similar to the things that I was showing at the beginning that kind of encapsulate a theme or an idea, or that tell us a particular story that we want to tell, where it comes to the really key themes that you'll see that we'll discuss in the panel discussions over the coming months. So for instance, the theatre's history around diversity and inclusion, accessibility in the arts, its role as a regional theatre. What does it mean to be a regional theatre? So kind of it's going to be very focused in what you can find on that platform, and showcasing kind of some of the detail of those themes. But then moving forward as well, sharing some of that rich material we've got from some of the big productions that the theatre's kind of the big projects and productions that it's remembered for quite fondly. And there's going to be we're going to be having some workshops in the communities over the next few months, where we engage with groups who have typically been kind of underheard or underrepresented in the archive. That's the kind of, when you were saying what's kind of caught my eye in the archive, it's often the things that aren't there that kind of catch my eye. It's the gaps in the archive. It's what's gone undocumented or what's not been represented. That's I tend to be drawn to, and so there's going to be a bit of exploring that over the next year. And because archiving it's a future facing act. When you archive something, you're thinking about the future and how it's going to be used, and so this is our kind of legacy now, like how do we want to use the archive? And I feel that's a really exciting kind of proposition to put into the communities, and to use it as a tool to kind of to inform really what we do next as a theatre, and what are the stories we want to hear, and what's the inspiration we want to take from the archive, from what's there and from what isn't there, is what kind of really I think is going to be really exciting about the project. So we'll be doing some workshops, but also commissioning new artworks, working with a commissioning group that we're going to recruit from the community workshops that we're doing, recording oral histories as well. So lots of people in the chat, for instance, I'll probably be getting in touch with you at some point to record some oral histories for people who've been connected to the theatre's history as well. So there's going to be lots kind of being shared over the coming year, really. So this is kind of, like you said, it's like the beginning, really, and I'm really looking forward to what the community is interested in, and then going back to the archive, doing more research based on that interest, and seeing what we find.
Thank you. I think that's great, and really kind of a potent way to think about an archive, that it's not just something that to be accessed, but it's something that acts as this. I had a question: can this archive be a catalyst for these really important conversations that need to happen now to ensure that there is that people feel welcome, that everybody feels welcome? And I think that I think it's really interesting to have heard that phrase when the Northcott opened it, its tagline was "a theatre for everyone," which is a really hard task, but it is a great aspiration. And how, hopefully these conversations will multiply and generate more conversations and feed into the life of the theatre and the archive, and be instrumental in terms of change and ongoing growth. I think was that notion of growth that, again, Rachel and Sandhya have both touched upon in different ways, but have articulated something about growth and moving forward into the future. I'm just wondering if we have anything, Rachel and Sandhya, that you haven't said that you're thinking, I really would like to. There's something else I'd like to say, or there's something that I meant to say and that I've forgotten. If there's anything, because I think we're coming towards the end of our time. So if you have any final thoughts, we would love to hear them.
I think what is exciting for the theatre is it seemed to, when it first started, the theatre in general was it was a time of, names, wasn't it? And go back to that thing about, the high profile names that we know. And actually, that's not what a theatre for the people is about. It is about serving their community. So whilst we all love to go to the theatre and see somebody we've seen on the telly, there's an excitement and a thrill about that. Actually, the real excitement in the thrill is seeing yourself represented on the stage, isn't it? And being part of something where you think, yeah, that's me, that's about me, that speaks to me, that tells my story too. And whether that's because you're on the stage yourself, you're working backstage as part of it, or as an audience member. So I think it's a really exciting time for the theatre, looking forward to making the community, it's representing its community. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think representing its community and just constantly remaining in dialogue with the community, because I'm all for being a consumer. I'm all for going and watching this amazing piece of dance, which I do love doing at the Northcott. Shobha Jaya Singh is one of my favorite choreographers, and I love it, and it's just such a treat. So it's kind of remaining in connection and dialogue with us, the community, as wide as possible, what that community means, and what do we want? What do we want to view? What do we want to take part in? What do we want to shape? And I think, yeah, exciting is the word I would use too. We are in an exciting time of reinvention, you know, so this conversation is fantastic today, because we're looking at that kind of disparity around gender and women, and you know, with that, as we've said already, intersectionality. So I think, you know, the arts, the theatre space, the Northcott is in such a privileged position to make change and transformation, and I, you know, I want everybody to really grasp that opportunity. Those would be my words. Yeah, grasp the opportunity for change.
Thank you both. I think the word transformation, when I think about theatre, is just is a great one, isn't it? And I think I want to say a massive thank you to Rachel and Sandhya for joining us, for Sophie for organising this event, and for Laura behind the scenes, who's been doing the technical work, and to Kelly Johnson for the marketing and the support for this event, and the team at the Northcott. And that I'm really excited for the rest of the panels, and how these conversations kind of grow and transform you know, how maybe an archive might be a catalyst for those transformative conversations, and also those transformative experiences on the Northcott stage. And you know, whatever the creative output is, and the wonderful and crazy eclectic mix and potential that there is out there to share on our stages. And one of the things I wanted to just ask, because it was something that I wondered about, to just go back to those original statistics. And I'm wondering, Sophie, whether we can find out beyond 2008 to see if the percentages have increased and where they are now, and to then think to within those actual percentages of women who've been in key roles, who've directed or written, which are probably, you know, the most identifiable kind of initial roles, and the range of artistic directors that we've had who have been women at the theatre, and in those executive roles, those are most identifiable ones. But how might that, you know, there be a next stage of then thinking about the intersectionality of those women who have contributed to the lifeblood of the theatre in those plays and things. So I'd be really interested, you know, when there's a moment, when there's time to kind of really get under those statistics, the last kind of 12 to 13 years, and as to see, you know, where we could go next. Reinvention and transformation.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think there's definitely some work to be done to bring the archive, you know, back up to date, and to interrogate those figures a bit more as well. So I think that's a really good really good lead for me and my team going back in the archive, because that's literally what I'm going to do tomorrow. So yeah, that is a really great and yeah, with that steer of reinvention as well.
I think, Sophie, could you tell us about the next platform, just so if people, just because I think it's a great way for people to know, because I personally am going to try and follow all these platforms, because I think it's a great initiative. So
yeah, definitely. So yeah, we're just to say thank you to everybody who's been watching, and I'm seeing all your comments now in the chat, and I'm really grateful. They're, you know, because it sounds like it's been, you know, interesting for you guys to listen to and interactive. So thank you for that. And yeah, it'd be brilliant if you guys came to our next panel discussion, which is going to be in about a month's time, beginning of June, which will be chaired by Louisa Adjoa Parker, who's been doing some work with us as a kind of artist practitioner, also kind of archive consultant, particularly around, as I was talking before, about the kind of the gaps in the archive, and you know, glaring kind of gap in the representation at the theatre has been of people from diverse ethnicities. and so there will be a panel exploring that in a month's time, and looking at the instances where diversity and inclusion has kind of been on the agenda at the theatre and how that was explored, and to look at kind of positive change and action that we could employ moving forward, you know, drawing from those ideas in the archive. And then, yeah, there'll be, towards the end of June, there'll be another panel looking at the importance of kind of local history and reminiscence, and how that, you know, how that can be a really helpful process for a community to engage with. And so we're going to be connecting up with Exeter Local History Group for that. I'm working with Janet Gale, who I know is in the audience for this one. Mike Redaway as well will be featuring on that panel. And some other people who have been connected to the theatre over the years. But yeah, at the end of this stream, I've been told that there will be a slide will appear which will have our kind of forthcoming panel events on there, which is quite slick. So yeah, they'll be all kind of signposted for the audience there, and they'll all be on our website as well, kind of. Yeah, all of the panel discussions we've got coming up over the year around, you know, like I said, accessibility as well. There'll also be a really future-facing one towards the end of the year, where we'll be imagining what do we want to see in the archive in 50 years' time, which I feel is a really exciting provocation for all of this kind of imagining that we've been talking about tonight. So yeah, I guess it's a good point maybe to wrap up. And again, thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel and Sandhya, for your time and wisdom and thoughts and hopes and dreams. And it was really, really interesting to hear you talk, and a privilege to listen. So thank you so much, and thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
Yeah, me too. Thanks. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you.